Hey y'all, it's Kim. So this is the Senate torture report, and let me look it up. It's got a long name to it. So it's the report of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence Committee study of the Central Intelligence Agency's detention and interrogation program. Remember, after 9/11, many suspected terrorists were detained for extended periods and tortured, according to this report. So let's get into this. We're on page 177 of 712. Another legal issue in the late 2005, or was related to the U.S. Department of Defense's involvement in CIA detention activities. In September 2005, the CIA and the Department of Defense signed a memorandum of understanding on this subject, and the U.S. military agreed to transfer two detainees, Ibrahim John and Abu Jafar al-Iraqi, to CIA custody. Both were held by the U.S. military without being registered with the ICRC for over 30 days, pending their transfer to CIA custody. The transfer of Abu Jafar al-Iraqi took place notwithstanding Department of State concerns that the transfer would be consistent with statements made by the Secretary of State that U.S. forces in Iraq would remain committed to the law of armed conflict, including the Geneva Conventions. In late 2005, during the period, the U.S. Senate was debating the Detainee Treatment Act, barring cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. The CIA subjected Abu Jafar al-Iraqi to its enhanced interrogation techniques. A draft presidential daily brief, or PDB, stated that Abu Jafar al-Iraqi provided almost no information that could be used to locate former colleagues or disrupt attack plans. The type of information sought by the CIA and the CIA's justification for the use of its enhanced interrogation techniques. Later, the statement that Abu Jafar al-Iraqi provided almost no information that could be used to locate former colleagues or disrupt attack plans was deleted from the draft PDB. Abu Jafar al-Iraqi remained in CIA custody until early September of 2006, when he was transferred to U.S. military custody in Iraq. The CIA seeks endgame for detainees in early 2005 due to limited support from liaison partners. There's a bunch of footnotes. Okay, in early 2005, the CIA again sought an endgame policy for its detainees, citing its unstable relations with host governments and its difficulty in identifying additional countries to host CIA detention facilities. Talking points prepared for the CIA director for a meeting with the National Security Advisor made the following appeal. CIA urgently needs the President of the United States and Principals Committee direction to establish a long-term disposition policy for the 12 HVDs, or high-value detainees, we hold in overseas detention sites. Our liaison partners who host these sites are deeply concerned by redacted press leaks, and they are increasingly skeptical of the U.S. government's commitment to keep secret their cooperation. A combination of press leaks, international scrutiny of alleged U.S. government detainee abuse, and the perception that U.S. government policy on detainees lacks direction in eroding our partners' trust in U.S. resolve to protect our identities and supporting roles. If a U.S. government plan for long-term detainee disposition does not emerge soon, the handful of liaison partners who cooperate may ask us to close down our facilities on their territory. Few countries are willing to accept the high or huge risk associated with hosting a CIA detention site, so shrinkage of the already small pool of willing candidates could force us to curtail our highly successful interrogation and detention program. Fear of public exposure may also prompt previously cooperative liaison partners not to accept custody of detainees we've captured and interrogated. Establishment of a clear, publicly announced detainee endgame one sanctioned by the President of the United States and supported by Congress, will reduce our partners' concerns and rekindle their enthusiasm for helping the U.S. in the war on terrorism. In March 2005, talking points prepared for the CIA director for a discussion with the National Security Council Principals Committee stated that it was only a matter of time before our remaining handful of current black site hosts conclude that the U.S. government policy on detainees lacks direction and the black site hosts ask us to depart from their soil. Continuation of status quo will exacerbate tensions in these very valuable relationships and cause them to withdraw their critical support and cooperation with the U.S. government. During this period, the U.S. Solicitor General, however, expressed concern that if CIA detainees were transferred back to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, they might be entitled to file a habeas petition and have access to an attorney. Meanwhile, the National Security Council continued to discuss a public rollout, and as described later in this summary, the CIA engaged in media directly in order to defend and promote the program. The question of what to do with the remaining detainees in CIA custody remained unresolved throughout 2005, during which time the CIA pursued agreements with additional countries to establish clandestine CIA detention facilities. The Detainee Treatment Act was passed by Congress on December 23, 2005, as part of the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2006. That day, the CIA suspended its interrogation program again. As described later in this summary, in February 2006, the CIA informed the National Security Council principals that the CIA would not seek continued use of all of the CIA's enhanced interrogation techniques. Press stories and the CIA's inability to provide medical care to detainees result in the closing of CIA detention facilities in country blank and blank. I don't know. I guess it's got a number next to it. So in October 2005, the CIA learned that Washington Post reporter Dana Priest had information about the CIA's detention and interrogation program redacted. The CIA then conducted a series of negotiations with the Washington Post in which it sought to prevent the newspaper from publishing information on the CIA's detention and interrogation program. Fearful that redacted, the CIA recommended the immediate transfer of CIA detainees to Department of Defense custody. When the Department of Defense rejected the proposal, the National Security Council directed the CIA to prepare other options. Meanwhile, two U.S. ambassadors, one in redacted and another in redacted, inquired whether Secretary of State Rice had been briefed on the impending Washington Post article and sought to speak to the Secretary herself to ensure that the CIA program was authorized. According to CIA documents, Secretary Rice was not aware of the specific countries where the CIA detention facilities were located. In lieu of a phone call, Secretary Rice, the CIA recommended that the State Department's Counterterrorism Coordination and former CTC DDO, Henry Crumpton, call the ambassadors. The Washington Post published an article about CIA detention sites on November 2nd, 2005. The publication of the Washington Post article resulted in a démarche to the United States from redacted, which also suggested that redacted contribution redacted could be in jeopardy. The United States also received a démarche from redacted. According to a CIA cable, U.S. representatives to redacted feared that if another shoe were to drop, there would be considerable ramifications for U.S. relations with redacted on a number of issues that depended on U.S. credibility in the area of human rights. The representatives also questioned whether the gravity of this potential problem is fully appreciated in Washington. The CIA cataloged how the Washington Post story created tension in its bilateral counterterrorism relations with redacted allies and determined that the article is prompting our partners to reassess the benefits and costs of cooperating with the U.S. government and CIA. That services have conducted aggressive high impact operations with CIA against targets, including redacted. We no longer expect the services to be as aggressive or cooperative. In April 2006, Redacted informed CIA officers that press stories on the CIA's detention and interrogation program led the government, the whatever government, to prohibit Redacted from providing information that could lead to the rendition or detention of Al Qaeda or other terrorists to U.S. government custody for interrogation, including CIA and the Department of Defense. Media leaks also created tensions with countries that had hosted or continued to host CIA detention facilities. For example, leaks prompted country officials to convey their intent to communicate directly with the Department of Justice and State. They then formally demarched the U.S. government. As late as redacted 2009, the redacted of country raised with Director Panetta the problem of the secret detention facility that had tested and strained the bilateral partnership. The redacted of country also stated that assurances were needed that future cooperation with the CIA would be safeguarded. After publication of the Washington Post article, Redacted demanded the closure of detention site Black within I don't know how many hours. The CIA transferred the remaining CIA detainees out of the facility shortly thereafter. Okay, let's see here. All that's redacted. Officers refused to admit CIA detainees Mustafa Ahmad al-Hassawi to a local hospital despite early discussions while country representatives about how a detainee's medical emergency would be handled. While the CIA understood the redacted officer's reluctance to place a CIA detainee in a local hospital or place a CIA detainee in a local hospital, given media reports, CIA headquarters also questioned the willingness of redacted to participate or originally planned or agreed planned with regard to provision of emergency medical care. After failing to gain assistance from the Department of Defense, the CIA was forced to seek assistance from 3 third-party countries in providing medical care to al-Hassawi and 4 other CIA detainees with acute ailments. Ultimately, the CIA paid the redacted something more than however many millions of dollars for the treatment of redacted, paid the redacted approximately redacted for the treatment of redacted, and made arrangements for redacted to be treated and redacted. Okay, the medical issue resulted in the closing of detention site Violet in 2006. The CIA then transferred its remaining detainees to detention site Brown. At that time, all CIA detainees were located in country. Meanwhile, the pressures on the CIA's detention and interrogation program brought about by the Washington Post story prompted the CIA to consider new options among what is called the dwindling pool, redacted partners willing to host CIA black sites. The CIA thus renewed earlier efforts to establish a detention facility in country. The CIA had provided millions of dollars to the country, redacted in preparation for potential CIA detention site, prompting the chief of station to comment, "Do you realize you can buy redacted for just a few $1,000,000, I guess?" I don't know. On December 2005, the chief of station in country met with the redacted, who was not concerned about the CIA's detention of terrorists in his country, but wanted assurances that the CIA interrogation program did not include the use of torture. In providing his approval, the redacted agreed to a request from the chief of station not to inform the U.S. ambassador in country. The CIA also reached an agreement with another country to establish a CIA detention facility in that country and arranged with the leadership of country not to inform the U.S. ambassador there. The CIA ultimately did not retain individuals in their country. In late October 2005, days after the publication of the Washington Post article, the CIA asked a separate country to temporarily house so many CIA detainees. The chief of station briefed the U.S. ambassador in country, who requested the National Security Council and the White House be briefed on the plan. There are no CIA records to indicate the briefing occurred. Country something's redacted then provided approval while seeking assurances that the CIA would develop a contingency plan in the detention site in case the detention site was exposed in the press, while the CIA station and the redacted, considered redacted in country, CIA headquarters directed that a long-term CIA detention facility be established in the country. Countries, something redacted, approved a plan to build a CIA detention facility, but noted this ongoing concerns about the lack of CIA exit strategy, the lack of emergency medical care for detainees, the issue that had forced the closing of detention site violent in country was raised repeatedly in the context of the construction of the CIA detention facility in country. March of 2006, CIA headquarters requested that the CIA station in country ask country to arrange discreet access to the nearest hospital and medical staff. The cable stated that the CIA looks forward to a favorable response prior to commencing with the construction of our detention facility. Construction nonetheless began on the facility without the issue of medical care, emergency medical care having been resolved. In 2006, after the deputy chief of the CIA station in the country, the deputy chief of RDG and the OMS officer met with redacted officers. The station reported that the establishment of emergency medical care proximal to the site was not tenable. In July of 2006, an OMS representative informed the chief of redacted at CIA headquarters that the facility in country should not be activated without a clear, committed plan for medical provider coverage. By the time a CIA team visited the country detention site in late 2006, the CIA had already invested so many millions of dollars in the new facility, describing the absence of adequate emergency medical care options as unacceptable. The chief of RDG recommended in a draft memo that construction efforts be abandoned for this reason. The following day, an edited version of the same memo described the issue as a challenge, but did not recommend that the CIA cease construction of the facility. The resulting CIA detention facility, which would eventually cost redacted millions, was never used by the CIA. Press reports about the CIA's detention interrogation program that appeared in redacted eventually forced the CIA to pass possession of the unused facility to the country's government. In early January 2006, officials at the Department of Defense informed CIA officers that Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld had made a formal decision not to accept any CIA detainees at the U.S. military base at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. At the time, the CIA was holding 28 detainees in its two remaining facilities, detention site Violet in country and detention site Orange in country. In preparation for a meeting with Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld on January 6, 2006, CIA Director Goss was provided a document indicating that the Department of Defense's position not to allow the transfer of CIA detainees to U.S. military custody at Guantanamo Bay. It would cripple legitimate in-game planning for the CIA. The talking points for the meeting suggested that Director Goss tell Secretary Rumsfeld that the only viable endgame for continued U.S. government custody of these most dangerous terrorists is a transfer to Gitmo. Absent the availability of GTMO and eventual DOD custody, CIA will necessarily have to begin transferring these detainees, no longer producing intelligence to third countries, which may release them, or the CIA itself may need to outright release them. After Secretary Rumsfeld declined to reconsider this decision not to allow the transfer of CIA detainees to U.S. military custody at Guantanamo Bay, CIA officers proposed elevating the issue to the president. CIA officers prepared talking points for Director Goss to meet with the president on the way forward on the program. On January 12, 2006, the talking points recommended that the CIA director stress that absent a decision on the long-term issue, so-called endgame, we're stymied, and the program could collapse of its own weight. There are no records to indicate whether Director Goss made this presentation to the president. 2005 and 2006, the CIA transferred detainees from its custody to at least 9 countries, including redacted, as well as the U.S. military in Iraq. Many of these detainees were subsequently released. In May 2006, the CIA had 11 detainees whom it had identified as candidates for prosecution by a U.S. military commission. The remaining detainees were described as having repatriation options open. The CIA considers changes to the CIA detention and interrogation program following the Detainee Treatment Act of Hamdan versus Rumsfeld. Following the passage of the Detainee Treatment Act in December 2005, the CIA conducted numerous discussions with the National Security Council principals about modifications to the program that would be acceptable from a policy and legal standpoint. In February 2006, talking points prepared for CIA Director Goss noted that National Security Advisor Stephen Hadley asked to be informed of the criteria CIA will use before accepting a detainee into its CIA counterterrorist rendition, detention, and interrogation program, stating that he believed CIA had in the past accepted detainees it should not have. The CIA director proposed future criteria that would require not only that CIA detainees meet the standard in the MON, but they possess information about threats to the citizens of the United States or other nations, and that detention in the facility, or CIA facility, was appropriate for intelligence exploitation. A few months later, redacted CTC Legal, redacted, wrote to Acting Assistant Attorney General Stephen Bradbury, suggesting a modified standard for applying the CIA's enhanced interrogation techniques. The suggested new standard was that the specific detainee is believed to possess critical intelligence of high value to the United States, while the proposed modification included the requirement that a detainee have critical intelligence of high value. It represented an expansion of CIA authorities insofar as to cover the detention and interrogation of an individual with information that would assist in locating the most senior leadership of Al-Qaeda, of an associated terrorist organization, even if that detainee was not assessed to have knowledge of or be directly involved in imminent terrorist threats. Anyway, I'm going to stop it here. We're on page 187. I will talk to y'all later. Have a great day. Bye.